Hello, drawing people! Today's lesson is on shapes. Shapes. What do I mean when I say shapes? I mean exactly probably what you're thinking of. We're thinking squares, triangles, circles, and maybe other things too. So, you're probably thinking here, why even focus on shapes? I mean, these are probably less complicated with lines. I mean, at least with lines, there was like issues with making sure you had like nice straight lines, or issues with having the thick and thin lines. With shapes, isn't shapes fairly obvious? It's just if you know lines, then you can probably do shapes as long as you're out of kindergarten or primary school. Well, the reason I bring them up is that when we're beginning art and we're getting into our drawing, we tend to overreach ourselves. We tend to overcomplicate things. We don't think of drawing the extreme basics. We think of the things that we really want to draw, that we see the great artists drawing. We want to do our fantastic portraits, our wonderful landscapes. We may even want to do things like drawing superheroes or anime characters. And when we do this, we tend to jump in too deep almost. We want to be able to draw those fantastic structures that we see, or get like that perfect like set of emotions. And along the way, we don't hit the basics. We don't think of things like squares, triangles, and circles and other shapes. We aim a little too big, essentially, and that's what I really want to do here. I want to bring us back down to the absolute basics. Now, we all know what squares, triangles, and circles are, and really these are just practice. In fact, this is pretty much one of the main exercises here. Just make sure you can draw things that can be recognized as squares and circles. Again, think of your lines exercises from before. Don't like chicken scratch them in. Try and draw them nice and clear. If you can do that, then you've often got a good start. But often you'll find that with less practice, and if you don't warm yourself up, like with this circle here, often they don't end up looking entirely like you want them to look. So I don't really need to bore you on the basic shapes themselves, but what we really want to do is we want to move on to making things beyond shapes. First off, we have irregular shapes, and these are shapes that may be more organic in nature, more abstract. So what do you do when you want to take it beyond the regular basic shapes? You want to have the irregular shapes, and an irregular shape is just simply a normal shape which is deformed in some way. So you may have a square, and you may have a crack in that square. And these are the types of things that you should kind of begin to get used to drawing. And these are the type of exercises you can do in your spare time. You can just draw shapes and just draw them slightly deformed. And as you can see, it's these deformed, irregular shapes on how we get other shapes. And we build upon this. So we take the shapes and we take the irregular shapes and we essentially smoosh them together. And the reason you're learning these shapes is really so that you can build upon things. When you're constructing your larger items, you may find yourself kind of pausing and thinking, well, I don't quite know how to draw that. I can't quite visualize it in my head. Well, shapes are usually the perfect tool for that. If you wanted to create something like, let's say, a door, well, in a way, what is a door but a series of squares and rectangles in various configurations? So really, if you know how to draw squares, you essentially know how to draw your doors. And this is very rough, but... and even things like the handle. As you can see, all a door really is, especially, this is definitely in a more cartoony sense, but all a door really is a series of squares and rectangles in an appropriate configuration. So, and you'll often find a lot of things are like this. So let's draw something a bit more complicated. Let's say a curved bottle of some kind. Well, doing this on a two-dimensional plane, so we won't be aiming for 3D. We'll be getting to that soon, don't worry. So, but a bottle would be nothing more than a rectangle. I'll stop calling them squares. And then a half circle on the top, and then a little square at the bottom. And maybe you can do a sort of smaller half circle on the bottom to kind of help give that curved feeling. Make it a bit flatter at the bottom. And essentially that's how it builds up from there. You get the idea. So when it comes down to it, your shapes are tools, and most of the time your shapes won't really be the final product in any real way. They'll be simply the accumulation of all the parts that come up to make the final product, or they can be a tool to use to help make the final product. Let's have an example here of another thing you can use shapes for is helping you when you're observing larger structures. Let's say you wanted to do a painting and you felt overwhelmed by the vast amount of information that was placed in front of you. Well, shapes are usually the way to go about capturing that information. Let's bring up an example here. So here's a picture of a canyon. And let's say that we wanted to paint or draw this canyon, but you think, where do I even begin? I mean, we've got some sky here up at the top, and we've got some cliffs here, a little bit of river here, and it's a case of, yeah, it can be very overwhelming, and you've got your canvas. Well, using shapes allows you to block it out. So, essentially, yeah, we've kind of looked to see where we can see the natural shapes in the landscape. So, if we take, for example, let me just give myself a bit of a clearer colour here. We've got a bit of a rectangle going on here, so we can use that there. We've also got plenty of other rectangles standing out here, and another one here, and we've got this sort of curved circle edge going on here, and another curved circle edge. And as you can see, as you're going along, you're essentially blocking the areas out using your shapes. And the shapes don't have to be perfect geometric shapes, obviously, so they can be irregular shapes too that just happen to fit it. And you can see that in a very short time, you start to block out all the important areas using your shapes. So that when you've finished, you can get the nice reflection bits too. I mean, there'll be part of this which is an exercise and observation, which is something we'll be definitely coming to later. But this is essentially how you want to look at your things and say, okay, so now you've essentially divided it into smaller subsections. So now you could then go to, say, this canyon area here and think, well, that's an even smaller set of squares. And if I mark them out, and you can even mark out things like this block of shade here, then you can see the different areas that you draw. So that when it comes down to drawing it, if you've got all this on your canvas, you can then do away with the original image and say, okay, I know roughly where I'm going from here. I know what's this area here is sky, and this area here is river, and I can just draw from there. So that's the basics of shapes. So, exercises for today. Exercises in green, apparently. So simply, practice with shapes. All this really has to be is simply getting a piece of paper, getting your biro and your paper, and just sketching your squares, sketching your triangles, play with the shapes. Also try to aim for more organic shapes, ones that kind of capture the idea of a shape. So let's say like you wanted to do a tree. So a tree. Tree is probably nothing more than a triangle with more triangles on top of it. You could even go for a rectangle with triangles. And just adding more, and as you can see, a tree starts to form. You can even go circle and tree. Second exercise is more of a mental one. Grab yourself an image, anywhere off the internet or anything like that, and just try to mentally see the shapes in the image itself. So perhaps grab a picture of a house and see all the squares and circles you can see, and how you would essentially frame those in a picture yourself. You could even get a sheet of paper to the side and just try to sketch the basic construction lines in that picture. The important takeaway here, shapes is a very basic set of fundamentals. Almost seems unimportant to focus on, but really there's a lot to be taken from shapes, and you take those shapes and you can make yourself a much better artist than you are now. Thank you for listening. See you in the next lesson.